Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The Memphis City Council on policing, coronavirus, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us as we continue to do the show remotely. We are joined tonight by two members of the Memphis City Council. First is Michael and Easter Thomas. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Along with Chase Carlisle, also of the Memphis City Council. Councilman, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here.
And of course, Bill Dries with the Daily Memphian. You all have had, at the Memphis level, the Memphis City Council has had a pretty intense debate and discussion about policing, which really kind of tracks the national debate and conversation about policing. But, I think as long as we've been doing this show, people have talked about crime in Memphis, the proper role of policing, the proper police strategies. The biggest issue this past week, and we'll talk about the issue narrowly, but it's representative, obviously, of a lot bigger issues. And I'll start with you, Councilwoman. The police residency question. You all have voted to, and you were part of the vote that said, let's take that question off the ballot, which basically negates the ability for the voters to vote and allow police residency to expand to 50 or 100 miles. I apologize, I can't remember which it was. Why are you opposed to that being on the ballot, and why are you opposed to residency being expanded right now?
Well, it's a couple of reasons for that. So one, I'm not seeing it as negating the voters' the ability to decide, but in more instead of encouraging us to do the right thing by the citizens of Memphis. So as we think about residency, my main arguments were on the side of we would like to re-implement community policing. We would like to encourage new residents and also city and government employees to be residents of the city of Memphis. And we do not want to deplete our tax base, build up other cities with our taxes, or open the door for the floodgate of over 5,000 law enforcement officials to move out of our county.
Let me go to you, Councilman Carlisle, and then I'll go to Bill to follow up on all of this. But I think if I'm right, you voted to keep that question on the ballot. Are you okay, separate from the ballot question, are you okay with expanded residency, more police officers coming in from outside Memphis, and as the Councilwoman said, potentially existing police officers moving out of the city and county?
Again, great question. Yes, I was for allowing the people to decide. We know that the public wants more police officers. We know that just looking at the last election, they voted to raise taxes on themselves for public safety. Both Mayor Harrington and Mayor Strickland ran on campaigns that openly talked about having more police officers. They received 93% of the vote. Mayor Strickland won every single precinct in the city for every city council district, county commission district, state rep district, and state representative. So Memphians want more police. When it comes to residency requirements, we're talking about getting to, according to the Janikowski study, 2,800. But the reality is that we can't even get to our minimum staffing complement of 2,200 police officers. And at a time when we're talking about limited resources for the city of Memphis, the most efficient, cost-effective way to get to that minimum complement is relaxing residency requirements. Everything else that we're going to talk about as far as recruiting police officers has a price tag attached to it. And so even at the end of the day, on how I feel about it, I was prepared to let the citizens of Memphis choose for themselves. There is no greater survey or sample of the population than a vote. That is what our democracy is based in, is letting the people decide for themselves.
Let me bring in Bill.
Councilman Carlisle, 2 weeks before there was the final vote on rescinding the referendum, the council got this new report from the consultants. And for years, we had been talking about 2,300 police officers by the end of 2020. All of a sudden, it's 2,800. That was kind of a sudden change. Do you think that 2,800 may be a bridge too far, given the times that we're in?
Well, thank you. Look, the Janikowskis are experts in their field. We've relied on their knowledge and expertise in data and facts, which is what we need to operate in. And the study that we have says 2,800 officers is the direction we need to go. And so if somebody else has expert data and research that is antithesis to that, or opposite of that rather, then I'm happy to look at that information, but it's the number that we have. For what it's worth though, I'm not sure it even matters at this point, because we continue to put roadblocks in the way of recruiting officers to Memphis to even get to our minimum complement.
Okay. Councilwoman Easter Thomas, is the goal of a police force of 2,800, let's say, counter to the concept of police reform, changing the way that police do their jobs?
Of course, Bill, and as you mentioned in stating that question to Councilman Carlisle, that number wasn't 2,800 a few weeks ago. So we already see that we're about to be privy to a very slippery slope in an increasing, ever increasing complement number that we will never be able to attain. And the ability or the non-ability to attract people to be police officers in Memphis is not a Memphis, Tennessee issue. It's a national issue. Let's be real with ourselves. Nobody is really putting police officer at the top of their career choice list in 2020. We have a lot of things going on nationally, internationally, in which we really are seeing a deficit in the hiring pool. Relaxing residency does not help when we think about police reform, when we think about re-implementing community policing. 2,800 is a large number, and that's also going off of one study commissioned by, I'm not sure whom, where their funding comes from, where their intent or encouragement for their questions is also deriving from. So I have a lot of questions about that one study that we were using for the basis of that number and for the basis of keeping that residency. But however, just back to the question that you asked, definitely not. More police does not equal less crime. We've seen that constantly, even with the last Tuesday's meeting that we had when we were talking about federal agents. More police does not equal less crime. As we saw, the U.S. Attorney came and talked to us about 2 different operations that have been expanded in Memphis. We've had more of those agents working with our police officers, and yet they still told us that violent crime rose. So we don't see the equation even with federal agents in our presence. And I think that's more indicative of a national scale issue that we are dealing with as a country and not just Memphis, Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Councilman Carlisle, I know you have very different thoughts on what a larger police force means on this. There is so much emphasis on the belief that more police in and of itself means less crime. It's been one of the main features of this whole discussion that the council has had over these last few months. Can that goal, though, coexist with other police reform measures, do you think?
Well, first off, I think not to split hairs here, but this is critically important to say. When we talk about crime and police, we're talking about violent crime here. And let me be abundantly clear, the study shows a correlation between more police officers and the reduction of violent crime in the city of Memphis. And I'm happy to send you guys the slides. You're welcome to put it up on your website. But more police officers with targeted intervention reduces violent crime. There is no question that poverty and opportunity link to crime, but no one is sitting here saying that all crime is going to be stopped. We are talking about targeted intervention on violent crime, taking repeat offenders, criminal organizations off the streets. And when somebody says, hey, they show up after the crime to take a report, that is false. Yes, police officers do respond to the scene of incidents, but they are actively pursuing repeat criminal, violent offenders like serial rapists, child traffickers, and organized crime rings. I cannot stress that enough. Law enforcement does so much more than respond to a home burglary after they've been taken off the street. And so we know that to be fact.
But we have about 200 more police officers since Jim Strickland became mayor. And yet our homicide rate is about to break the record from 2016.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And I think that you're looking at a time right now in which police officers have the lowest approval ratings throughout the country based on what is going on. And I think for a lot of them, it's very difficult to do their jobs without the support. For Memphis in particular, though, back to facts, while we may have 200 more officers, we were down to 1,800 and we're not where we need to be to have our full complement. So to the Janikowski study specifically, when you talk about community policing, our officers spend far too much time responding to calls and filling out administrative paperwork than spending time in their communities. And the only way that they're going to get there is to have more officers so that they can spread around the duties. I'll further touch on this. The MPD works 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We have 9 precincts with 6 wards, and our minimum staffing complement is 12 police officers a shift. And we can barely staff our minimum complement in these wards. Chick-fil-A has more people working the breakfast shift than we have patrolling the streets of Memphis at particular wards. That is a significant problem. How can you possibly have good interactions with the community when you're stretched so thin?
Before I send this back to Eric, Councilwoman Easter Thomas, what do you say to that? Do we, if 2,800 is not the number in your mind, do we need more police officers in some measure?
Well, I just want to be clear that I agree with everything Councilman Carlisle just said. I just want them to live in Memphis.
And real quick, I want to respond to that. I can appreciate that. And I've said this multiple times. Council members are elected and they're certainly entitled to their opinions. Councilwoman Eastern Thomas and I have had conversations where you don't go tell someone how they feel, you don't police their emotions, and I completely agree and respect that position. My position comes from research and facts, and I've stated this before. When we talk about residency, the Communities United Against Police Brutality, which is based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, has research that says that where police officers live has little to zero direct impact on their ability to be good officers. It takes policies, procedures, and cultural reform. It has nothing to do where they put their head down at night. And I laud Councilwoman Easter Thomas and Councilman Smiley for leading the charge on getting some of these policies written down. But the change has to come from within and building back trust. But where people live does not correlate with the quality of policing they do.
Let me go back to Councilwoman Easter Thomas. So you're fine with the 2,800? Just to clarify, that when you said you agreed with everything that Councilman Carlisle said, or is for you the number somewhat less than 2,800?
The number, I think, is irrelevant as we're talking about the quality of work that police officers are able to do. And I think that does come with, we have to look at certain roles and responsibilities that we're putting on our law enforcement that maybe should be diverted to social workers, that maybe should be diverted to HCD, community development, youth services, as we talk about what specific things they are doing in the community, what's being responded to as far as mental calls to 911 center. So I think we need to also look at that in the broader police reform of what are we asking our police officers to do? And then maybe that can free up more time and more ability to do what we need to do to address crime and safety. However, where a police officer lives does affect, as Councilman Carlisle says, it says it may not affect or impact how good of a police officer they are, but it does impact how good of a city we have. Because if where you lay your head does not put taxes back into the youth services program, that 2,800 number, we can't even get to funding 2,800 kids for the summer program in the city or the county. when we talk about where that police officer lays their head at night and not money going towards our homelessness initiative, that impacts because people call the police on those same homeless individuals that maybe we would have more funding for if we were not paying a police officer that stays outside of our county. So when we think about long term, that's where the impact comes in for Memphis City and Shelby County.
I mean, let me go to Councilman Carlisle. I mean, one of the things that Mayor Strickland brought back with the support of council when he, I think in his first term, was the patrol, the people the group that goes to minor traffic incidents.
The PST program.
Say it again.
PST program.
PST
the boys in khaki, men and women in khaki.
Yeah, and people see them and they're in the white cars. They're officials, they're city officials, but it's not a full-blown police officer because it's, you need to go through you don't need to use a police officer for those sorts of incidents. Let's, as you're saying, and Mayor Strickland has said, and other people have said, let's have the police do the things they really need, where we need police officers. To the councilwoman's point, should we be looking at bringing in other types of targeted teams for nonviolent offenses? In this whole national conversation I mentioned on the show before, it kind of opened my eyes when someone said a very simple thing, that there's a mental illness problem with a homeless person acting out in the street. It's sad, it's maybe somewhat dangerous, but let's say it's not violently dangerous. It's as much as anything dangerous, most dangerous to themselves. Why do we send an armed police officer there? Why don't we send a social worker or a mental health professional? Do we need to start looking at things in more targeted ways, the way the councilman said?
It's great. I mean, and you're right. I'm glad you said national conversation because it is it is happening nationally. But, we already have programs in place like the crisis intervention team that responds to thousands of mental health crisis calls. And it's a national program that's actually called the Memphis model. But I understand that we're not specifically just talking about mental health. We're talking about other services. And this goes back to having a focus on social services in general. And Bill asked this earlier, and I agree with it. And this is where sometimes that you'll see my frustration is these things, these initiatives of HCD and of equitable housing and blight and opportunity can run on parallel paths to addressing violent crime. And I said this while I was campaigning. I said this right after I took office. There are things that we need to take care of in the very near immediate future. And there are things that we need to work on that are going to have huge implications when we talk about trying to address generational poverty down the road and opportunity. I will also want to address this tax base argument, because when we talk about using terms long-term, if you're telling me that we have 1,900 officers under the referendum, they all could have left the city of Memphis. I bet most wouldn't. But and I've run the math and we've talked about it, ad nauseum at the council. I'm willing to take that tax loss in the very short future because it's so de minimis if we can drop violent crime. Because the reality is, as someone who works in the business community and is very involved with a lot of these business leaders, one of the biggest issues that we have in recruiting businesses to Memphis, which provides jobs and opportunity, is they're scared of the violent crime issues in the city of Memphis. And so if we are going to address opportunity, then we are going to have to work on violent crime. And that's going to come with an all hands effort, but it's going to have to start with more police officers reducing violent crime.
Let me go back to Bill here, Bill Drees.
So at this point, it looks like the question of whether there's going to be a referendum has been settled. The ordinance to rescind the referendum was passed. The mayor vetoed it. Within an hour after his veto came down, the council voted to override that veto. But let me ask each of you, starting with Councilwoman Easter Thomas, what do your constituents tell you should come first when it comes to police reform?
Well, first, my constituents tell me that they are struggling with unemployment. They're struggling with poverty. They're struggling with feeding their children and the people around them. They're struggling with unweatherized homes and high utility bills. They're struggling deciding how they're going to support their children with this new virtual school year and during this pandemic. They're struggling with getting their hours and being able to stay home from sick time. And in none of those conversations on when my constituents call, email me, do they mention that the amount of police will help any of their issues that they're calling me about. However, on this certain topic about police numbers, I have only had a few that initially, because you have to think about with that study, with the Janikowski study, and also the survey that was commissioned that was put on our council, those questions had emotionally tied words that would invoke certain responses from people. So if you're asking me, Michaelin, would you like to have more police officers in order to keep you safe? Of course, my answer would be yes. However, if you'd ask me, do you think more police officers would solve the problems of crime in Memphis? My answer would be no, because of all of those factors that I told you constituents call, email, text, DM, Facebook message, write letters, call the staff about. So I have not had a lot of negative commentary or questions even asking for more police, knowing that that has the possibility of sending monies elsewhere that definitely will not come back to our community.
Councilman Carlisle, what do you hear from your constituents? What comes first on this? Mindful of your admonition that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, what do your constituents say should be the priority?
Well, when we talk about priorities, I have to think about the 173 families that have to deal with losing a loved one this year to murder, and
including,
I have to think about those families, and now when we talk about addressing these issues, that residency's off the ballot, it's now going to be more costly and take longer to hire, recruit, and train quality police officers. And as far as addressing other issues, I brought a resolution forward dealing with the Community Development Block Grant Program. When we talk about equitable housing, when we talk about the layers of government, the city of Memphis does not have the United States Treasury. It does not have the reserves of the state of Tennessee. And we have different layers of government that have different roles and responsibilities. If we talk about criminal code reform, that's at the state of Tennessee level. We talk about the jail, that's county commission. We talk about funding, federal housing and equitable housing. We've created the Community Housing Trust Fund, but the reality is when you look at other cities, a lot of that firepower comes from other sources. And so we just have to be mindful of that as we are making decisions on what the city of Memphis does or is and isn't able to do. It's one of the big reasons that consolidation is out there in the ether, is figuring out how we can move forward efficiently and effectively to serve our citizens. But in the very near term, what I hear from my constituents is they're sick and tired of being scared of violent criminals, and they want somebody to stand between them and chaos. And those are the men and women in blue who, by the way, a overwhelming majority serve honorably and with distinction. And we need to hold those that don't accountable. And that is with the council's continued efforts on transparency and accountability and training. And when we talk about training, it takes money to train.
Let me go back. Councilman, you raised your hand. You said, do you want to elaborate on what you just said?
Councilman Carlisle said the 173 families who have dealt with losing a loved one to murder this year, and I made sure to say that include me in that number, as we buried my cousin a few months ago due to her murder. That was caused by domestic violence, which is another factor, a part of community services, social work services that we need to improve upon in this city. As she was murdered this year by her husband, and her husband committed suicide as well. So, however, I do want to just pinpoint that we're hearing different things from our constituents because we have a different constituent base. So within my district, you have some of the poorest zip codes in the country. So of course, my constituents are not saying the same things as Councilman Carlisle because his district does not encompass that in this city. So we need to recognize that we have a stark divide socioeconomically, which also falls along racial lines and can be tied to almost every issue that we're seeing in this city. So I just wanted to pinpoint that.
Yeah, well, and I said, but the Zoom may have cut it off. I'm sorry, that's a horrible.
I just want to state though that I do represent half the city, and my base is 50-50 and is a wide variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. But I hear the councilwoman.
Yeah, let me, with just a minute left for both of you, real kind of quickly. We've alluded to this, and it's basically, you know, the backdrop of all this is spending, right? And coronavirus and the recession we're in, and you know, the hit to property taxes that probably will happen. You know, you've got a lot of businesses that have closed. You've got a lot of retail that's going out of business. Are you worried, Councilwoman? I'll start with you. What do you think the budget's going to look like next year? All these things we're talking about, take whether it's more on the community policing side, or it's on the social services side, or it's on the cops with a gun and a badge side. It all takes a lot of money, and we're in a bad economy.
Definitely, that's one of the long-term things that I'm thinking about as we just came from my first and I would say very rough budget season, as we were trying to navigate those things during the midst of COVID-19, but also thinking about what else can have a negative impact on the monies that we're able to take in and the monies that we're able to divest and invest from as we look at every single department within our city government. So when I do think about, as Councilman Carlisle said, a lot of the monies that we need to fund things such as Community Block Grant, HCD, other community initiatives, we may not have that access, but it seems like we always have money to fund things in law enforcement, even if it comes federally, as we saw this past week, where the U.S. Attorney told us that over $11.1 million was given to law enforcement. And when I asked about other things that would be preventative to crime, there was no answer for where we could find that funding.
All right, well, we are out of time, so you're going to get the last word on this. Thank you both for being here. Thanks for joining us by Zoom. And thank you all for listening and watching. Remember, you can get the past episodes of Behind the Headlines on the WKNO website, or you can download podcasts of the show from the Daily Memphian or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.